We're here in Indianapolis for the 2024 NFL Scouting Combine. I'm Chase Senior. You're watching Eagles Now. He is Sam Monson, lead NFL analyst for Pro Football Focus. We're talking some birds here on the show, and I want to start with the decision to bring back head coach Nick Sirianni. Look at what he did his first couple of years. Year one of a rebuild, Philadelphia is able to make the playoffs after a slow start. Year two, 14-3, number one seed in the NFC, make it to the Super Bowl. And this year, they start 10-1. And then they really collapsed at the end of the year. They lost 7 of 8. And I know that obviously with how you examine the game of football, analytical, but you look at film, you're very smart and heady as you approach the game of football. Philadelphia's offense in 2022, very explosive. In 2023, they weren't that. And when you have a new play caller in Brian Johnson, that can obviously impact things a little bit. But what drives me nuts, 32nd in pre-snap motion rate. I just don't understand that. Players respect him, but he doesn't call plays. He's one of those game-managing head coaches that kind of oversees the entire operation. Your thoughts on Sirianni and the decision of bringing him back for 2024?
Yeah, it's funny. On the one hand, you're like, the year before, they were a play or two away from winning a Super Bowl, right? And so getting rid of that guy the following year sounds crazy just from that point of view. On the other hand, the collapse that they had was so incredible and so kind of unprecedented. And it's almost impossible to find a way of looking at that isn't, it's a head coaching failure. I mean, obviously other things went wrong as well, but the head coach is the guy that's tasked with, okay, this thing is spiraling out of control. You got to pull it back together and tie it back up before we get to the playoffs. And it didn't happen. And in fact, anything that Sirianni did made it worse. You know, they give control of the defense over to Matt Patricia, and that only enhanced things.
Disaster.
So it's very difficult it would feel incredibly harsh to get rid of him given where they had just been. On the other hand, it's very difficult to point the finger of blame at basically anybody else as the chief kind of culprit of what went wrong. So I think, if you're ownership, you say, all right, we have our end of season meeting, our debrief. Tell me how you're fixing this, right? Because this ended catastrophically, and there are people calling for your head, and they kind of have a point. So convince me that you're the guy to put it back together. And assuming he did that, I think it's fair enough given where he had been before, to the Super Bowl, a couple of plays away, 10 wins before it all collapsed, to say, all right, let's give him the chance to put the pieces back together. I think you're right that losing both coordinators last season probably played a huge part and was a massively kind of underrated aspect of what the Eagles were going to do this year, particularly given the start as well. It probably papered over those cracks and said, that's not a problem. But I think the longer it went on, the more it became clear that they just didn't have the coaching expertise that they had a season ago. Bringing in a guy like Vic Fangio this year, I think, has to help that hugely. He's still the best proponent of that defense, which at least a year ago was maybe the most in vogue system in the NFL on the defensive side of the ball. Maybe now it's falling out of favor a little bit, but he's still, I think, the best version of that defense as its chief architect. I think bringing in Fangio will make a big difference to the defense and the offense. One aspect we tend to ignore or don't talk about as much is Jalen Hurts was hurt all year. He was playing, he was able to get through it, he was able to do some good things, but that he was not 100% at any point in the season. That has to have played a part in what was happening. The offensive line should still be really strong, even if Jason Kelce officially walks away. They have skilled position players. The receivers are good. Tight end. There's no reason that offense can't be a really good unit in a year's time, and the defense should be dramatically better. So I think it's right that people were questioning his job status and his security, Sirianni, but I think he's earned the chance to be the guy that puts it back together.
You talk about Vic Fangio and his fingerprints of his defensive system really just sprinkled across the entire NFL. I like that hire. I thought he did maximize what was a very injured Dolphins defense all throughout the 2023 campaign. Kellen Moore, though, specifically, when he was with Dallas, just a top 5 overall offense, pretty much year in, year out. And then with the Chargers, not the case. Justin Herbert hurt. It was kind of a disaster under Brandon Staley. He is creative. He does run pre-snap motion, and he's going to bring in his system. Nick Sirianni talked about it yesterday, how he believes it could kind of mesh with Sirianni's vision offensively. Do you think that Moore can bring the best out of Jalen Hurts so we see more so of the 2022 Hurts as compared to the 2023 Hurts?
Yeah, I think so. I think the jury is still out a little bit on what exactly Kellen Moore is and how good a coach he can be. He was supposed to be the guy that provided the answers to Justin Herbert last year and unlocked this extra layer of potential that everybody thinks is there. It didn't really happen. the Dallas offense got better when he left, when Mike McCarthy took over. But I think the absolute bottom line with Kellen Moore is he's a solid coach at minimum, right? So in a season where the offense wasn't where you expected it to be, the defense wasn't where you expected it to be, where both coordinators had left, where you had kind of lost the divisionary force on both sides of the ball, you've got Fangio coming in on defense, and you've got Kellen Moore coming in on offense, who should minimum just stabilize everything, make sure we're in a solid spot, and then we'll see how good it can be with Jalen Hurts and meshing with this Kellen Moore system. But I think it's a good sort of smart addition to just make sure this is no longer a question mark.
So we covered the coaching changes for Philadelphia, OC, DC, a lot more experience than what the Eagles had with Sean Desai as well as Brian Johnson, who are inexperienced coming off a Super Bowl. Let's look ahead at free agency here. Philadelphia's in a really interesting position. You talked about the weapons offensively. You still have A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert. Depending on what happens with Jason Kelsey, Cam Jurgens slides over from right guard to center. Maybe you go Tyler Steen at right guard, but it's still a pretty solid offensive line with Jordan Mailata, Landon Dickerson, and Lane Johnson at the very least. Defensively, there's got to be a little bit of a makeover. You're able to check that box off with Vic Fangio. What does Philadelphia have to improve upon in the draft, in free agency here, to tinker with this roster to get them back on track?
Yeah, they've been a very good team at kind of keeping an eye on the future and drafting with next year or the year after in mind. And now that's a little bit more precarious than it's been in previous years. Either moves haven't necessarily worked out, or simply more players have started to turn over, and you've just got more spots to fill. Last season kind of showed the danger of playing that game. Like, I think it's the smart way of doing it. I think ultimately it's the correct way to try and future-proof your roster, but it's always an unknown. A guy like Nakobe Dean stepping in, expected to be the new anchor in the middle of that defense, and he's hurt basically the entire year, but even if he played, we still don't really know if Nakobe Dean would have been able to step in and be that guy. So if one of those moves doesn't work, now you're a year off. You've sort of left a year lag to fix it and to try and get better. So I think all three levels of the defense now need an injection of talent. That defensive line, they've invested in these guys, the Georgia players on the defensive line. Obviously, Jalen Carter was spectacular for the first half of last season. He really cooled off down the stretch. They need him to take that step forward now and be an all season long dominant stretch. Jordan Davis, I think, needs to be more consistent. And they need a sort of resupply in terms of consistent edge rusher impact. Nolan Smith didn't really do much last year at all. They really need either a Nolan Smith or somebody else to step forward and be a consistent source of pressure on the edge, because that defense was always at its best when it could run deep in terms of pass rushers. Now you've got Fletcher Cox probably going. You've got Brandon Graham probably growing. These are two of your most experienced, longest tenured, consistent impact playmakers in that defensive line. And at the very minimum, you just need to restock that and keep going.
Howie Roseman has always kind of invested smartly and been somewhat cheap at linebacker and safety going into 2023. The Eagles, as far as positional spending, were 31st and 32nd at linebacker and safety. Does a player like Patrick Queen in free agency make sense? Do you think that's a route Howie Roseman could go? Because under Fangio, first of all, linebacker expertise, because he used to coach linebackers, he's developed them. Or do you think the Eagles might go a cheaper route once again, maybe an Andrew Van Ginkel, who's a different player, but has that Vic Fangio tie?
Yeah, I think they're unlikely to spend big at the positions of conventionally seen as lower value. The Eagles are very, very strict when it comes to, we invest our biggest spending and our biggest draft capital at those high value positions, and we circle back around later with much cheaper investments in the lower value positions, whether it's linebacker, safety, running back, all those kinds of things. I think that's the smart way of doing it. It's just that you need to get those picks right. So I would imagine between free agency and the draft, they're going to be focusing on pass rush. They're going to be focusing maybe on that offensive line, and they're going to be focusing on corner before they're touching safety and linebacker.
Do you think L'Jarius Sneed could be a trade candidate? He just got franchise tagged by Kansas City. James Bradbury carries a big cap hit, so moving around some money might have to take place, but Eagles said to be interested here at the Combine in Sneed.
Yeah, I think he's certainly a trade candidate. I think if the right offer comes along, Kansas City would be open to it. They've supposedly allowed him to kind of seek that trade. We're going to franchise tag you. We're not letting you walk for nothing. But if a deal comes in that's worth it for us to do, we're open to that conversation. So, yeah, if the Eagles are as desperate for cornerback help as that, they could absolutely construct a trade that makes sense for L'Jarius Sneed, who can play inside, outside, defend the run, cover in every way, is a top-tier NFL corner.
Another trade candidate is Hassan Reddick, and what's great about being here at the Combine, the news just keeps flowing. You have the Caleb Williams, Pete Thamel story. You have L'Jarius Sneed franchise tag. Is he going to get traded? And then a report coming out just moments ago before we threw on the headset that multiple teams have called Philadelphia about a Hassan Reddick trade. He's an interesting player. He's 29 years old. He wakes up, and he gives you double-digit sacks every year. 2022 had 16. This past year, 11. But Eagles sack numbers across the board were down. And him being 29, over the last 4 years, I looked at his numbers compared to Myles Garrett's. Garrett's obviously the better player, defensive player of the year, has more sacks, but they're not far off. But he's making $25 million per year. I don't think Reddick is due that salary, but the word is that his camp is asking for about that. If it comes to that, do you pay him? Could he be traded by Philadelphia? What's kind of your outlook on Reddick?
Yeah, I think, he's not in that very top tier of pass rushes, but he's at the top of the next tier down, right? And the question is, what salary does that command in a league where the salary cap just jumped by, $30 million more than people expected it to be? I suspect you probably need to keep him around for no other reason than they don't have alternatives anymore. If Nolan Smith had been a dominant player right away, as a rookie and looked like the heir apparent essentially to Hassan Reddick, maybe it's a different answer. But absent that, Hassan Reddick is your primary source of pass rush at this point. He's the one guy that is going to get you those double-digit sacks, that's going to get you 50 pressures a year, that's going to be consistently affecting the quarterback. And because of his speed, dynamism, explosiveness, the plays that he can make are potentially game-changing plays as well. He's not just going to get slow developing pressure late in the down. He's going to beat his guy quickly and make an impact on that opposing quarterback, like Brock Purdy in the NFC Championship game. If he wins quick, he's there at the quarterback by the time he's trying to make a play. So maybe he's not worth that kind of money. On the other hand, with a higher salary cap, it's a more palatable number that in a couple of years probably doesn't look as bad.
Before we let you go, it's known in your Twitter bio, you're Irish. So were you born in Ireland? And if so, how did your love of football kind of take off?
Yeah, not just born in Ireland, but there up until 2017,
That's
all
incredible.
the change in my accent has occurred in the last 7 years since we moved over here.
Because we had Gordon McGuinness on last year, and he's also from Ireland, right?
No, he's Scottish.
Scottish,
Yeah.
that's right.
But he's still got the accent. I've moved around quite a lot as a kid, so my accent has changed significantly multiple times. I've had like half a dozen different ones, and now it's losing its Irishness and becoming some sort of weird transatlantic Golf Channel variant of Irish American. The long story short, we lived in Minnesota for a year when I was a kid. So from that point on, I was into football.
Okay, interesting. And like when you're growing up overseas, this is known as an American game. Like,
Right.
How does your love for football kind of start?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly, I think I got into it at the right time where it was becoming a bigger sport over that side of the Atlantic, and it became easier to access, and it became, on TV more and all those kinds of things. And obviously the internet becoming a big thing made it easier. Like if it was 10 years before, it would have been much more difficult. Then you're talking about like newspapers and, archaic ways. There's no way of seeing it at that point. But I got kind of lucky timing-wise. It was easy enough to follow it from there.
Yeah, now a lot of people know Pro Football Focus. I mean, we pass along your data, your information, your numbers here on the show. It's so funny when we do player breakdowns and we don't include their Pro Football Focus grades. People are like, where are the PFF grades? But for those not familiar, tell people where they can find you on social media and what you bring to the table with Pro Football Focus.
Yeah, PFF.com. Obviously, we get talked about as, an analytics site, and we contract with all 32 NFL teams, with all the FBS teams as well, with like 200-plus teams total between FBS, FCS, CFL, NFL, all these kinds of things. The UFL now, I think, as well. And the thing that makes us different from any other analytics site or anything else is we are watching and grading every single player on every single play. And whether or not you agree with a specific grade on a specific play, simply doing that exercise is adding a whole raft of information that doesn't exist if you're not, right? And even if there's a margin for error there, if you get a play or two wrong, you're better off than just eyeballing it and guessing how a guy played, right? Simply going through and doing that exercise of tabulating.
In this hot take world.
Yeah, did he do a good job or a bad job in this play, or was it somewhere in the middle? Simply doing that exercise is adding a layer of context that doesn't exist anywhere else. And it's not the be all and end all. It's not the only thing you need. It's not one answer for how good is a player, this number, but it's extra information.
Sam Monson right here on Philadelphia Eagles Now. Thanks for joining the show. Don't forget to subscribe here, but also follow him with everything he's doing.